Welcome to Vesper Shroud, the place where ordinary people whisper the darkest truths. And the night always feels a little too still. Tonight, we wander deep into the Appalachian Mountains, an endless stretch of ridges and hollers where shadows move like they're alive, and silence carries more weight than words. These mountains are ancient, older than memory itself, and they've soaked up centuries of stories. Campfire warnings, roadside terrors, and encounters so unexplainable, they stay with you long after you've left. The tales you're about to hear aren't fiction. They come from real people, passed down through locals, or lived firsthand under the canopy of those haunted hills. If you're drawn to true horrors and mysteries, make sure you subscribe and tap the bell. That way, you'll never miss when the night decides to whisper again. Now, keep your light close, because the first story begins just beyond the tree line. Story 1. Living Shadow of the Copperhead Mine. I watched the shadow move up the wall of my bedroom, and that is when I knew I was going to die. Not today, maybe not this week, but eventually, the shadow would find me. The shadow always finds you. My name is Marcus Webb, and I work as a safety inspector for abandoned mining operations across Appalachia. It is a thankless job, mostly bureaucratic paperwork and checking structural integrity on facilities that should have been sealed and forgotten decades ago. I thought I understood danger. I thought I understood what working in these dead, creepy places really meant. I was wrong about everything. The Copperhead Mine sits in a remote section of eastern Kentucky, about 40 miles from the nearest town. It operated from 1922 until 1958, extracting copper ore from deep underground shafts that descended nearly 2,000 feet into the earth. In 1958, something went horrifically wrong. Heavy rains caused groundwater to breach the main shaft. The mine flooded within hours. 83 men were underground when it happened. 72 of them drowned before rescue crews could reach them. 11 managed to climb to higher levels and survived, but they emerged traumatized and refusing to speak about what they witnessed in the darkness below. The mine officially closed after that disaster. The entrance was sealed with concrete. The equipment was left to rust. For 65 years, the place sat untouched, a monument to tragedy and poor safety practices. Then the state decided to conduct a comprehensive review of all abandoned mining operations, and I was assigned to inspect the Copperhead. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind was coming down from the mountains, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The mine entrance was marked with weathered warning signs, but the concrete seal had cracked over the decades, and someone had pried open a section large enough to squeeze through. That should have been my first warning. That someone, or something, had recently decided to go inside. I reported the compromised seal to my supervisor, but he told me to proceed with the inspection anyway. The damage looked old to him. Just natural deterioration from freeze and thaw cycles. Nothing to worry about. He was wrong. I was about to step into something terrifying, something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what is possible in this world. Something that would fill me with a kind of fear that doesn't have a rational explanation. The interior of the mine was cold and dark, lit only by my flashlight. The air smelled of rust and something else, something organic and unsettling, a scent like copper mixed with damp earth and something that reminded me of stagnant water. The main shaft extended downward into darkness. Water covered the floor about 3 feet deep, reflecting my flashlight in an unsettling, eerie way that made it hard to judge depth or distance. I knew the mine was flooded below, but I wasn't prepared for how much water had accumulated even at this entrance level. I was documenting the damage on my tablet, making notes about structural integrity and water damage, when I first noticed the shadow. It was moving on the surface of the water, a dark shape that seemed to flow rather than move in any normal sense. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light. But then it changed direction. It moved toward me deliberately, gliding across the water surface like oil spreading across glass. They tried to describe this shadow to people, but I don't have the words. It wasn't solid like a person, this shadow. It was more like a liquid darkness, a substance that could flow and reshape itself while maintaining a kind of cohesive form. As it moved, it left a faint trail of what looked like steam or mist in the air. And the smell, the creepy, disturbing smell, became stronger. Copper and damp earth and something ancient and wrong. I aimed my flashlight directly at it, and the shadow stopped moving. It seemed to shrink away from the light, but not completely. It just became more diffuse, spreading out across a larger area of the water while maintaining some kind of presence. I've never been so terrified by something so impossible to comprehend. This wasn't a monster with teeth or claws. This was something outside the boundaries of what I understood to be real. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadow. It didn't pursue me, but it watched. I could feel it watching, even though it had no eyes. I could feel its attention focusing on me the way a predator focuses on prey. I retreated to the mine entrance, climbed out through the cracked concrete, and called my supervisor immediately. He thought I was having a psychological episode. He suggested the stress of the job had gotten to me. He told me to go back in and complete the inspection. I refused. For the first time in my career, I refused a direct order. I knew that going back into that mine would result in my death or something worse. Something more horrifying than death. Over the next few days, I did research. I contacted the survivors of the 1958 disaster, now in their 80s and 90s. Most of them didn't want to talk about it, but one man, Harold Kress, agreed to meet with me. He was 92 years old and living in a care facility in Kentucky. Harold told me something that no official report had ever documented. He said that when the water started flooding the shaft, the miners tried to climb to safety. But the darkness was complete, and they were panicking. Harold said he saw something moving in the water, something that shouldn't exist, something that seemed to be hunting them. He said the shadow moved faster than anything biological should move. He said it wrapped around miners and dragged them deeper into the water. He said it was intelligent. It was deliberate. It was feeding. Harold said that after the flood, after they were rescued, he heard rumors from the other survivors. They claimed that the shadow hadn't been created by the flood. They believed the shadow had always been in the mine, living in the deepest shafts, and the flood had somehow awakened it or released it. Some of them believed it was the ghost of the miners who drowned, merged into one horrifying, terrifying entity. Others believed it was something older than the mine itself, something that had been sleeping in the earth for centuries. Harold died 3 days after our conversation. His death was ruled a heart attack, natural causes, but I received a message from his daughter that disturbed me deeply. She said that Harold had been fine until he spoke with me. She said he seemed terrified after our meeting, looking over his shoulder constantly, complaining about shadows moving on the walls. She said his last words before the heart attack were about a smell, about copper and damp earth creeping into his room. That is when I understood. The shadow had found Harold because Harold had told me about it. The shadow had crossed over through his memory, through his words, through the act of bearing witness to its existence. I tried to ignore the research. I tried to pretend that Harold's death was coincidence. But the terrifying, chilling truth was becoming impossible to deny. 3 weeks after Harold died, the shadow appeared in my apartment. It was night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, my mind churning with everything I had learned about the Copperhead Mine. That is when I saw it, a dark shape moving across my bedroom wall, flowing like liquid, leaving that distinctive smell of copper and damp earth. The shadow moved with purpose, exploring my room, testing the boundaries of the space as if it was looking for something. I turned on every light in my apartment. The shadow retreated into the corners, becoming less distinct but not disappearing entirely. I could feel its presence even when I couldn't see it clearly. And I understood something terrifying in that moment. The shadow wasn't confined to the mine anymore. It had followed me. It had followed the knowledge I carried inside my head. Over the next 3 weeks, the shadow became a constant presence in my life. It would appear in my apartment at night, moving across walls and ceilings, that creepy copper smell announcing its arrival. I tried everything. I tried moving to a new apartment. The shadow found me within hours. I tried staying in hotels in different cities. The shadow appeared in the hotels. I tried staying with my sister in Colorado, as far from the mine as I could get. The shadow appeared in her house, and she started experiencing panic attacks. When I left and the shadow followed me, her symptoms stopped. I realized the horrifying, unsettling truth. The shadow was bonded to me now. It had attached itself to my consciousness the moment I saw it in the mine. And every person I told about it, every person I warned, became a secondary anchor point. The shadow could reach them too. I stopped telling people. I stopped calling my supervisor or filing reports. I realized that the most moral thing I could do was to isolate myself completely, to tell no one about what I experienced. to live out whatever remained of my life in complete and total silence. But the shadow is getting stronger. I can feel it. Every night it stays a little longer. Every night it moves a little faster. Every night it gets a little closer to my skin. I started researching ways to end things, ways to stop the shadow, its progression. But I don't. Do you know if suicide will even work? I don't. Do you know if the shadow can be killed or if it will simply continue existing after I am dead, using my body as its anchor point to the world of the living? The most terrifying realization is this. I don't. Do you know how many other people the shadow has reached? I don't. Do you know how many people I inadvertently infected through casual conversations or emails or forum posts about the Copperhead Mine? I don't. Do you know if the shadow is still confined to Appalachia or if it is spreading across the entire country? I don't. Do you know if it is in your city? I don't. Do you know if it is watching you right now, moving in your peripheral vision, that faint scent of copper and damp earth, the only sign of its presence? The living shadow of the Copperhead Mine is real. It exists in that abandoned mine, and it exists in the minds and spaces of everyone who has learned about it. The 83 men who drowned there in 1958 didn't find peace in death. They found something worse. They transformed into something that hungers, something that spreads, something that can move through memory and knowledge and fear itself. I'm sitting in my apartment right now, surrounded by lights, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to sleep, afraid of the moment when the shadow finally decides it's time to stop playing. I can see it moving across my walls in the periphery of my vision. I can smell the copper and the damp earth. I can feel it waiting for the moment when I become tired enough, weak enough, desperate enough to stop running. I am telling you this story because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand that some places are dangerous not because of what they are physically, but because of what has been imprisoned within them for so long. You deserve to understand that knowledge itself can be a curse, that learning about certain things opens doors that can never be fully closed. But I am also telling you this story because I am desperate. I am desperate for someone to know that I am suffering. I am desperate for someone to understand that the shadow is real. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people know about it, if the knowledge spreads far enough and wide enough, the shadow, its power will dissipate. Or maybe the shadow will spread faster than ever before, reaching millions of people through the simple act of hearing this story, listening to these words, learning about the terror that lives beneath the earth in eastern Kentucky. Here is my question for you. If you knew that hearing a story could curse you, that simply possessing knowledge could attach a supernatural entity to your existence, would you stop listening right now? Or do you keep listening because you need to know what happens next? Because the fear itself is what is holding you captive? Tell me in the comments. Tell me I'm not alone. Story 2. Sacrificial Lambs of the Church of the Broken Cross. The children, this choir is singing again, and I know what that means. Every autumn equinox, just as the sun starts to set, I hear them. Those high, innocent voices rising in hymns that should sound beautiful but instead carry something dark and hungry. And I know that tonight, somewhere in the hills outside Grafton, Oregon, the dead are gathering at the ruins of the Church of the Broken Cross. I know because they seen them, because I was there, because part of me never really left. I am a travel blogger, 41 years old, divorced, living out of a converted van and chasing stories across the Pacific Northwest. Urban exploration, they call it. I photograph abandoned buildings, research forgotten towns, turn tragedy into content for an audience that craves the creepy and the unsettling. It is a living, not a great one, but it lets me stay on the move, and moving is the only thing that keeps the nightmares at bay. Last September, I was researching obscure religious sites in Oregon when I stumbled across a reference to the Church of the Broken Cross. The name alone was enough to catch my attention. A small, extremist congregation that had operated in the hills outside Grafton from the 1920s until 1953, when it was raided by state police. The details were sparse, buried in old newspaper archives and police reports that had been sealed for decades. But the rumors were everywhere. Human sacrifice, blood rituals, a pastor who believed that God demanded blood payment for earthly blessings. And every autumn equinox, the congregation would gather to offer their sacrificial lambs to ensure the harvest would be plentiful. The locals refused to talk about it. When I stopped at the general store in Grafton to ask for directions to the church ruins, the woman behind the counter went pale. She told me to leave it alone. told me that some places were better left forgotten, that people who went looking for the Church of the Broken Cross didn't always come back the same. But I didn't listen. I never do. That is my problem. The church sat at the end of a logging road that hadn't been maintained in 60 years. I hiked 3 miles through dense forest, Douglas fir and western hemlock so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. The air was cool and damp, smelling of moss and decay. The only sounds were my footsteps on the overgrown trail and the distant calls of ravens. I found the church just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. September 22nd, the autumn equinox. I hadn't planned it that way. The timing was coincidence, or at least that is what I told myself. The building was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure, maybe 30 feet long, with a peaked roof that had partially collapsed. The walls were weathered gray, covered in moss and vine. But the most disturbing feature was visible immediately. The cross on the front of the building, mounted above where the door had been, was broken in the middle. Snapped, hanging at an angle like a neck twisted wrong. I photographed the exterior as the light turned golden. The images were haunting in the way I hoped. Atmospheric, the kind of content that would perform well. But there was something else in those photos, something I didn't notice until later when I was reviewing them on my laptop. Shadows in the windows that didn't match any trees. Shapes that looked almost human, watching from inside the darkness. I should have left then. Should have hiked back to my van before the sun set completely. But I needed interior shots. The story wasn't complete without seeing inside the place where these horrifying rituals had supposedly occurred. The door hung on broken hinges. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not the expected mustiness of an abandoned building, but something sharper. Metallic, like old pennies left in the rain, like blood that had soaked into wood and never quite washed away. The interior was a single room with rough wooden pews facing a raised platform at the front. An altar, I realized, made from a single slab of stone that looked too large to have been carried up the mountain by hand. And on the altar, dark stains that my mind screamed were just water damage. Just rust from metal that had corroded. Just anything but what they actually looked like. I set up my camera and started shooting. The flash illuminated the space in bursts, revealing details I couldn't see in the fading light. Names carved into the pews, dates, and words that made my skin crawl. Sacrifice, atonement, blood covenant, the language of a congregation that had twisted faith into something monstrous. That is when I heard the singing. It started soft, barely audible. Children, voices, maybe a dozen of them, singing a hymn I didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful but wrong, like it had been written in a key that didn't quite exist. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the church with an eerie, unsettling harmony. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The church was empty. No choir, no children, just me and the shadows and that impossible singing that grew louder with each passing second. And then I saw them. They appeared like fog condensing into form, figures in old-fashioned clothing, materializing in the pews as if they'd been there all along and I'd just been too blind to see them. Men in dark suits and women in long dresses. Children in their Sunday best, mouths open in song, eyes fixed on the altar at the front of the church. The congregation of the Church of the Broken Cross gathered for their autumn equinox service. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch as more figures appeared. Dozens of them, filling every pew, their translucent forms glowing faintly in the dying light. They looked solid enough to touch, real enough to be alive, but I could see through them to the walls beyond. At the front of the church, on the raised platform, a figure stood, taller than the others, wearing the robes of a pastor. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his mouth moving in words I couldn't hear over the children, the choir. He raised his hands, and the congregation rose as one. The singing changed, became something darker. The children, his voices took on a desperate quality, a pleading note that sent ice through my veins. And I realized they weren't singing hymns of praise. They were singing hymns of fear. Two figures emerged from the shadows at the back of the church, dragging something between them. Someone, a person, struggling weakly, dressed in white. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, couldn't see their face. But I could see the terror in their movements, the way they fought against the hands that held them. The sacrificial lamb. The figures dragged the victim toward the altar. The pastor, His mouth moved faster, his hands gesturing in ritualistic patterns. The congregation swayed in their pews, their ghostly forms flickering like candle flames. And the children kept singing, their voices rising to a crescendo that felt like it would shatter my skull. I tried to run, tried to turn and flee through the broken door, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if invisible hands held me in place, forcing me to witness what was about to happen. To see what this congregation had done every autumn equinox for 30 years. The victim was placed on the altar, held down by multiple hands. The pastor raised something above his head, a blade, long and curved, glinting in the spectral light. And I understood that I wasn't just watching a memory. I was watching a reenactment, a phantom ritual played out by the dead, over and over, for eternity. The blade came down, the victim, his scream cut through the singing, a sound so full of agony and terror that it felt physical. The congregation surged to their feet, hands raised, mouths open in silent cries of ecstasy. The children's choir reached a fever pitch, and blood spread across the altar, dark and thick and impossible because these were ghosts, weren't they? These weren't real people. This wasn't really happening. But the blood looked real, smelled real, pooled on the stone and dripped onto the floor, steaming in the cold air. The pastor lowered his blade and turned. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. That broke whatever spell held me. I stumbled backward, crashed into a pew, and felt my legs finally obey. I ran, burst through the doorway into the twilight and didn't stop running until I was back on the logging road, my lungs burning, my heart threatening to explode from my chest. Behind me, the church stood silent. No light, no figures, no singing, just an abandoned building in the woods, rotting slowly into the earth. I made it back to my van and drove. Didn't stop until I reached Portland, 2 hours away. Didn't look at the photos on my camera. Didn't think about what I seen. Just drove through the darkness, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Exhaustion. Too many horror stories absorbed into my subconscious. But when I finally looked at the photos the next day, I saw them. All of them. The congregation in the pews, the children singing, the pastor with his blade raised, and on the altar, clear as day, a figure in white with a face twisted in terror. I researched obsessively for weeks, dug through every archive I could access, every newspaper clipping, every police report. The truth was worse than the rumors. The Church of the Broken Cross had been led by Pastor Elijah Thorne, a charismatic preacher who debroken from his mainstream denomination in 1922. He believed that God required blood sacrifice, just as in the Old Testament. That prosperity and blessings came through offering innocent lives. He called them lambs, pure souls given to God to ensure earthly abundance. The congregation, isolated in the hills, slowly embraced his teachings. At first, it was animals, livestock slaughtered on the altar, but the harvest remained poor. The winters grew harsh, and Thorne convinced them that God demanded more. Human sacrifice. Every autumn equinox, the congregation would select a lamb from among themselves. Sometimes it was a member who sinned. Sometimes it was a stranger who wandered too close to their isolated community. Sometimes it was a child, because Thorne said children were the purest offerings of all. The police estimated that over 30 people were murdered in that church between 1923 and 1953. The exact number was never confirmed because many victims were transients, drifters, people no one would miss. The congregation buried them in the forest, scattered and unmarked. The church was raided after a member escaped and reported what she witnessed. Pastor Thorne and 15 congregation members were arrested. 8 were convicted of murder. Thorne died in prison in 1957. The rest served varying sentences, though most claimed they'd been under his psychological control, that he manipulated them into believing murder was divine will. The church was abandoned, left to rot, and for decades, no one went near it. But the locals knew, they'd always known, that every autumn equinox, if you were foolish enough to be near those ruins at sunset, you'd hear the children's choir. You'd smell the blood. And if you were unlucky enough to go inside, you'd witness the ritual reenacted by spirits that couldn't move on. Trapped in their guilt, trapped in their horror, trapped in the moment they chose murder over mercy. I thought that would be the end of it, that seeing it once would be enough, that I could walk away and never think about the Church of the Broken Cross again. But last week, September 22nd came around again. And at sunset, no matter where I was, I heard the singing. Those children's voices, high and sweet and terrified. I was in Seattle, 200 miles away, but I heard them as clearly as if I were standing in that ruined church. And I knew I'd witnessed their ritual, I'd seen their sacrifice, and somehow, in seeing it, I'd become connected to it, bound to it in a way I don't fully understand. Now, every autumn equinox, I hear them, the congregation of the damned, forever reenacting their crimes. And I wonder how many others have stumbled across that church over the decades. How many others are out there right now, hearing phantom children sing hymns of blood and fear? The disturbing thing, isn't just that they re-trapped. It's that they seem to want witnesses, need them, as if by making others see their horror, they can somehow distribute the weight of their guilt, share the burden of their damnation. I tried going back, thought maybe if I could perform some kind of cleansing ritual, or document everything properly, or contact their descendants, I could break the cycle. But every time I get close to those hills, the fear becomes overwhelming. My hands shake, my vision blurs, my body refuses to take me back to that place. So I'm stuck with this, with the knowledge of what happened, with the sounds of their ritual echoing in my head every year when the equinox arrives, with the question that haunts me more than anything else. The victims, the lambs, where are their ghosts? Why did I see them? The congregation is trapped in their guilt, forever reenacting their sins. But what about the innocent people who died screaming on that altar? Where did their spirits go? Are they free, or are they trapped somewhere worse, somewhere I haven't seen yet? And the truly terrifying thought, the one that wakes me up at night in a cold sweat, what if I'm not just a witness? What if, by being there on the equinox, by seeing the ritual, they've taken the place of the lamb in some cosmic sense? What if next year, when I hear the singing, I want to be listening from a distance? What if I'll be there, on that altar, with the pastor, this blade raised above me? The Church of the Broken Cross still stands in those hills. The congregation still gathers every autumn equinox. And now you know about them too. You heard their story. You imagined their ritual. So here is my question for you. If you had the chance to witness something truly horrifying, something that would haunt you forever but would give you knowledge no one else has, would you take it? Would you walk into that church? Or would you do what the locals do and leave some horrors buried in the past where they belong? Write your answer in the comments, because next autumn equinox, the children will sing again. And maybe this time, I want to be listening alone. Story 3. Appalachian Banshee as well. I heard the screaming at midnight, and I knew everyone in this town was going to die. My name is Eleanor. I'm 53 years old, a nurse who has lived in Hollow Creek, West Virginia for 30 years. I know this town better than I know my own reflection. I know every street, every person, every hidden crevice of the mountains that surround us. So when I heard that sound on Thursday night, that horrible, anguished wailing coming from the ridge above our town, I understood immediately that something terrifying was coming. Something that couldn't be stopped. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not human, but not animal either. It was something caught between the two. A voice that seemed to come from pain so profound it transcended normal emotion. The scream rose and fell, echoing off the mountain walls, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache and my blood freeze solid in my veins. I got out of bed and went to my window, but I couldn't see anything. Just darkness and the distant ridge, and that horrible, chilling wail that seemed to be looking for something. My husband was still sleeping. I didn't wake him. I couldn't explain what I was hearing, couldn't put words to something that didn't have a rational explanation. So I just stood there listening, watching the mountain, knowing with absolute certainty that the sound I was hearing was a warning, a harbinger of something dark and terrifying that was about to unfold. By Friday morning, everyone in Hollow Creek had heard it. We gathered at the diner, our small town, this natural meeting place, and we talked about the screaming. Old men who lived here their entire lives said they'd never heard anything like it. Young mothers held their children close and asked if anyone knew what could make a sound so disturbing and eerie. The police chief, a man named Garrett who held his position for 20 years, claimed he heard nothing. But I could see the fear in his eyes. He heard it. Everyone had heard it. The town's history started bubbling up in our conversations. Someone mentioned old Appalachian legends, stories passed down through generations about spirits that haunted these mountains. Someone else brought up the banshee, that Irish myth about a woman whose wailing predicted death. Old Tom Blackwood, who ran the hardware store, mentioned that his grandmother had told him stories about something similar in the mountains, though he always dismissed them as superstition. I felt my stomach drop. I'd grown up hearing those same stories from my own grandmother, tales she insisted were real. Warnings about a spirit that walked the ridges during times of great danger. I always assumed they were folklore, nothing more than stories to frighten children into behaving. But now, having heard that sound myself, I wasn't so certain. By Saturday, the screaming had become constant. It didn't happen just at night anymore. We could hear it during the day too, though it seemed muffled, as if the daylight made it harder for the sound to propagate through the valley. But at night, it grew louder, more desperate, more frantic. The wailing came from different ridges now, as if whatever was making the sound was moving around our town, circling it, searching for something or someone. People started leaving. Families packed their cars and drove out toward the interstate. The police didn't try to stop them. Nobody wanted to stay in a town that was being hunted by something that screamed like that. I wanted to leave too. My rational mind was screaming at me to get my husband and drive away from this nightmare. But something kept me here. Some instinct that told me running wouldn't matter. The sound would follow us regardless. By Sunday, the screaming had intensified to something that transcended horror. The wailing had developed a rhythm now, a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. It wasn't random noise. It was almost like language, like the spirit was trying to communicate something specific, trying to warn us about something particular. And then, in the early hours of Monday morning, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The banshee was calling names. I heard mine, echoing off the mountains, my name spoken in that terrible, mournful voice. I heard my husband's name. I heard names of people I known for 30 years, people I cared for, people I lost. The spirit was calling out the names of everyone who would die. That is when I understood. This wasn't just a warning of danger. This was a confirmation. This was the banshee marking those of us who wouldn't survive what was coming. And I'd been marked. I was going to die in whatever catastrophe was about to strike our little town. By Monday afternoon, the rain started. Not normal rain. This was torrential, devastating rain that came in waves, turning the sky from gray to almost black. The meteorologists were baffled. There was no weather system that could explain this kind of precipitation. It was as if the sky was emptying itself, as if something was forcing all available moisture from the clouds in a deliberate attempt to flood our valley. The banshee, its wailing grew even louder, almost triumphant now. The scream had evolved into something that sounded almost like laughter, horrible and ancient laughter echoing through the darkness and the rain. I stood on my porch watching the water begin to collect in the streets, watching it rise, understanding with absolute clarity that we were being overwhelmed by something that couldn't be fought or reasoned with. The authorities tried to organize evacuation. Garrett and his officers went door to door, telling people to head to higher ground immediately. But it was too late. The roads were already flooding. The bridge that connected our town to the highway was underwater. We were trapped, cut off, isolated in a valley that was slowly filling with water. I gathered my family in our living room, my husband and our daughter, who had come home from college when she heard about the screaming. We held each other while the water rose outside, while the banshee continued to wail, while the night became so dark it felt like we'd been swallowed by something alive. The water reached our first floor around midnight. We moved to the second story, then to the attic as the flooding accelerated. The rain had become so intense that the windows were useless. We could see nothing but water and darkness. The sound of the current, the roar of the floodwaters combining with the banshee, its wail, created a symphony of horror that seemed to exist outside normal reality. Around 3 a.m, the wall of earth came. The mountains that had protected our town for generations suddenly gave way. Years of heavy rain had saturated the soil, and the additional precipitation from this supernatural storm had pushed the ground beyond its capacity. The mountainside simply collapsed, and when it did, it brought tons of earth and rock down toward our town. The ground shook so violently that I thought it would tear open and swallow us all. The landslide buried the southern edge of Hollow Creek. Homes were crushed, buildings were obliterated, and the water, now mixed with mud and debris, became a raging torrent that swept through what remained of our town. My house, built on slightly higher ground, survived the initial impact. But as the water continued to rise, I knew it was only a matter of time. I held my family close, listening to that eerie, terrible wailing outside, understanding that the banshee wasn't just predicting our death. It was orchestrating it. It was calling the disaster forward with its terrible voice. When the water reached the second floor, my husband went to the attic to get more blankets and supplies. He didn't come back. I waited, listening to the water rising, listening to the banshee wail, and I understood that his name had been among those the spirit had called. He was already gone, pulled away by the current, dissolved into the chaos of the flood. My daughter was crying, holding on to me, asking what was happening, asking if we were going to die. I couldn't lie to her. The water was rising toward the attic. The end was coming, and the banshee, its wailing had become almost peaceful now, almost satisfied, as if it was watching its prediction come true, confirming its prophecy through the destruction it had summoned. Then, just before the water reached the attic room, everything stopped. The rain ceased, the wind died, the water stopped rising, and the banshee, its wail transformed into something entirely different. The screaming became words, and I understood them. The spirit was asking me a question. It wanted to know why I was still alive. It wanted to know why I hadn't followed my husband into the depths. I realized then that the banshee wasn't calling names of people who would die. It was calling names of people who had already died, people who had been swept away, people who were already gone. My name had been called, but I wasn't dead. My daughter wasn't dead. We were still breathing, still existing in that attic room while everyone else had been taken. I understood what the banshee wanted. It wanted to know why we remained. It wanted confirmation that we understood the horror of surviving when others hadn't. It wanted us to acknowledge that we would live with this knowledge forever, that we would carry the weight of this tragedy for the rest of our lives. I gave it what it wanted. I told my daughter about the banshee, about the old legends, about how some spirits exist to warn us of catastrophe. I explained that we had been given a gift and a curse. The gift of survival, the curse of knowing that the banshee had chosen which of us would live and which of us would die. The water began to recede after that. Slowly, gradually, as if whatever had summoned the flood had decided to release us. By dawn, the rain had stopped entirely. The sun rose on a landscape transformed into a nightmare of mud and destruction. The official death toll was 47 people, nearly a third of Hollow Creek's population, including my husband and most of my close friends. The disaster was attributed to a combination of factors: unusual rainfall, geological instability, and terrible timing. No one could explain the epicenter of the damage or why some areas of town were completely obliterated while others survived relatively untouched. I didn't try to explain it. I didn't tell anyone about the banshee or the screaming or the names being called in the darkness. Who would believe me? Who would accept that a supernatural spirit had orchestrated a disaster that killed dozens of people in our small Appalachian town? It's been 6 months now. The town has begun to rebuild. The displaced families have slowly returned. Life has tried to resume some semblance of normalcy. But I know the truth. The banshee is still out there, still in the mountains, still watching and waiting. The screaming has stopped, but I hear it sometimes, in my dreams. That terrible wailing that preceded the end of my old life. I am recording this testimony because I need people to understand what is coming. I need people to know that there are forces in the mountains, ancient and powerful forces, that exist beyond our understanding. When you hear that sound, when the banshee starts to wail, you need to leave immediately. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to explain it. Just run and pray that your name wasn't among those called. My daughter survived. She is 14 years old, and she remembers everything from that night. She hears things that aren't there, sees shadows that shouldn't exist, understands on a level that no child should have to understand that death is real and arbitrary and can come at any moment. The authorities have investigated nothing. The government has filed reports attributing the disaster to natural causes. But I know what happened. A banshee came to our mountains and called forth destruction. It marked the names of those who would be taken, and it watched as their fates unfolded exactly as it had predetermined. So here It's my question for you, listener. If you heard something terrifying in the night, something that defied explanation and filled you with absolute dread, would you trust your instinct to run? Or would you rationalize it away and stay? Tell me in the comments. Because the Banshee is still calling names in the darkness. And I have a terrible feeling it was preparing for another wailing soon. And when it does, some of us won. Be here to tell you about it. Story 4. Living Shadow of the Copperhead Mine. I watched the shadow move up the wall of my bedroom, and that is when I knew I was going to die. Not today, maybe not this week, but eventually, the shadow would find me. The shadow always finds you. My name is Marcus Webb, and I work as a safety inspector for abandoned mining operations across Appalachia. It is a thankless job, mostly bureaucratic paperwork and checking structural integrity on facilities that should have been sealed and forgotten decades ago. I thought I understood danger. I thought I understood what working in these dead, creepy places really meant. I was wrong about everything. The Copperhead Mine sits in a remote section of eastern Kentucky, about 40 miles from the nearest town. It operated from 1922 until 1958, extracting copper ore from deep underground shafts that descended nearly 2,000 feet into the earth. In 1958, something went horrifically wrong. Heavy rains caused groundwater to breach the main shaft. The mine flooded within hours. 83 men were underground when it happened. 72 of them drowned before rescue crews could reach them. 11 managed to climb to higher levels and survived, but they emerged traumatized and refusing to speak about what they witnessed in the darkness below. The mine officially closed after that disaster. The entrance was sealed with concrete. The equipment was left to rust. For 65 years, the place sat untouched, a monument to tragedy and poor safety practices. Then the state decided to conduct a comprehensive review of all abandoned mining operations, and I was assigned to inspect the Copperhead. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. The sky was overcast, and a cold wind was coming down from the mountains, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The mine entrance was marked with weathered warning signs, but the concrete seal had cracked over the decades, and someone had pried open a section large enough to squeeze through. That should have been my first warning. That someone, or something, had recently decided to go inside. I reported the compromised seal to my supervisor, but he told me to proceed with the inspection anyway. The damage looked old to him. Just natural deterioration from freeze and thaw cycles. Nothing to worry about. He was wrong. I was about to step into something terrifying, something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what is possible in this world, something that would fill me with a kind of fear that doesn't have a rational explanation. The interior of the mine was cold and dark, lit only by my flashlight. The air smelled of rust and something else, something organic and unsettling, a scent like copper mixed with damp earth and something that reminded me of stagnant water. The main shaft extended downward into darkness. Water covered the floor about 3 feet deep, reflecting my flashlight in an unsettling, eerie way that made it hard to judge depth or distance. I knew the mine was flooded below, but I wasn't prepared for how much water had accumulated even at this entrance level. I was documenting the damage on my tablet, making notes about structural integrity and water damage, when I first noticed the shadow. It was moving on the surface of the water, a dark shape that seemed to flow rather than move in any normal sense. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light. But then it changed direction. It moved toward me deliberately, gliding across the water surface like oil spreading across glass. They tried to describe this shadow to people, but I don't have the words. It wasn't solid like a person, this shadow. It was more like a liquid darkness, a substance that could flow and reshape itself while maintaining a kind of cohesive form. As it moved, it left a faint trail of what looked like steam or mist in the air. And the smell, the creepy, disturbing smell, became stronger. Copper and damp earth and something ancient and wrong. I aimed my flashlight directly at it, and the shadow stopped moving. It seemed to shrink away from the light, but not completely. It just became more diffuse, spreading out across a larger area of the water while maintaining some kind of presence. I've never been so terrified by something so impossible to comprehend. This wasn't a monster with teeth or claws. This was something outside the boundaries of what I understood to be real. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the shadow. It didn't pursue me, but it watched. I could feel it watching, even though it had no eyes. I could feel its attention focusing on me the way a predator focuses on prey. I retreated to the mine entrance, climbed out through the cracked concrete, and called my supervisor immediately. He thought I was having a psychological episode. He suggested the stress of the job had gotten to me. He told me to go back in and complete the inspection. I refused. For the first time in my career, I refused a direct order. I knew that going back into that mine would result in my death or something worse. Something more horrifying than death. Over the next few days, I did research. I contacted the survivors of the 1958 disaster, now in their 80s and 90s. Most of them didn't want to talk about it, but one man, Harold Kress, agreed to meet with me. He was 92 years old and living in a care facility in Kentucky. Harold told me something that no official report had ever documented. He said that when the water started flooding the shaft, the miners tried to climb to safety. But the darkness was complete, and they were panicking. Harold said he saw something moving in the water, something that shouldn't exist, something that seemed to be hunting them. He said the shadow moved faster than anything biological should move. He said it wrapped around miners and dragged them deeper into the water. He said it was intelligent. It was deliberate. It was feeding. Harold said that after the flood, after they were rescued, he heard rumors from the other survivors. They claimed that the shadow hadn't been created by the flood. They believed the shadow had always been in the mine, living in the deepest shafts, and the flood had somehow awakened it or released it. Some of them believed it was the ghost of the miners who drowned, merged into one horrifying, terrifying entity. Others believed it was something older than the mine itself, something that had been sleeping in the earth for centuries. Harold died 3 days after our conversation. His death was ruled a heart attack, natural causes, but I received a message from his daughter that disturbed me deeply. She said that Harold had been fine until he spoke with me. She said he seemed terrified after our meeting, looking over his shoulder constantly, complaining about shadows moving on the walls. She said his last words before the heart attack were about a smell, about copper and damp earth creeping into his room. That is when I understood. The shadow had found Harold because Harold had told me about it. The shadow had crossed over through his memory, through his words, through the act of bearing witness to its existence. I tried to ignore the research. I tried to pretend that Harold's death was coincidence. But the terrifying, chilling truth was becoming impossible to deny. 3 weeks after Harold died, the shadow appeared in my apartment. It was night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, my mind churning with everything I had learned about the Copperhead Mine. That is when I saw it, a dark shape moving across my bedroom wall, flowing like liquid, leaving that distinctive smell of copper and damp earth. The shadow moved with purpose, exploring my room, testing the boundaries of the space as if it was looking for something. I turned on every light in my apartment. The shadow retreated into the corners, becoming less distinct but not disappearing entirely. I could feel its presence even when I couldn't see it clearly. And I understood something terrifying in that moment. The shadow wasn't confined to the mine anymore. It had followed me. It had followed the knowledge I carried inside my head. Over the next 3 weeks, the shadow became a constant presence in my life. It would appear in my apartment at night, moving across walls and ceilings, that creepy copper smell announcing its arrival. I tried everything. I tried moving to a new apartment. The shadow found me within hours. I tried staying in hotels in different cities. The shadow appeared in the hotels. I tried staying with my sister in Colorado, as far from the mine as I could get. The shadow appeared in her house, and she started experiencing panic attacks. When I left and the shadow followed me, her symptoms stopped. I realized the horrifying, unsettling truth. The shadow was bonded to me now. It had attached itself to my consciousness the moment I saw it in the mine. And every person I told about it, every person I warned, became a secondary anchor point. The shadow could reach them too. I stopped telling people. I stopped calling my supervisor or filing reports. I realized that the most moral thing I could do was to isolate myself completely, to tell no one about what I experienced, to live out whatever remained of my life in complete and total silence. But the shadow is getting stronger. I can feel it. Every night it stays a little longer. Every night it moves a little faster. Every night it gets a little closer to my skin. I started researching ways to end things, ways to stop the shadow, its progression. But I don't know if suicide will even work. I don't know if the shadow can be killed or if it will simply continue existing after I am dead. using my body as its anchor point to the world of the living. The most terrifying realization is this: I don't know how many other people the shadow has reached. I don't know how many people I've inadvertently infected through casual conversations or emails or forum posts about the Copperhead Mine. I don't know if the shadow is still confined to Appalachia or if it is spreading across the entire country. I don't know if it is in your city. I don't know if it is watching you right now, moving in your peripheral vision, that faint scent of copper and damp earth, the only sign of its presence. The living shadow of the Copperhead Mine is real. It exists in that abandoned mine, and it exists in the minds and spaces of everyone who has learned about it. The 83 men who drowned there in 1958 didn't find peace in death. They found something worse. They transformed into something that hungers, something that spreads, something that can move through memory and knowledge and fear itself. I'm sitting in my apartment right now, surrounded by lights, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to sleep, afraid of the moment when the shadow finally decides it's time to stop playing. I can see it moving across my walls in the periphery of my vision. I can smell the copper and the damp earth. I can feel it waiting for the moment when I become tired enough, weak enough, desperate enough to stop running. I am telling you this story because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand that some places are dangerous not because of what they are physically, but because of what has been imprisoned within them for so long. You deserve to understand that knowledge itself can be a curse, that learning about certain things opens doors that can never be fully closed. But I am also telling you this story because I am desperate. I am desperate for someone to know that I am suffering. I am desperate for someone to understand that the shadow is real. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people know about it, if the knowledge spreads far enough and wide enough, the shadow, its power will dissipate. Or maybe the shadow will spread faster than ever before, reaching millions of people through the simple act of hearing this story, listening to these words, learning about the terror that lives beneath the earth in eastern Kentucky. Here is my question for you. If you knew that hearing a story could curse you, that simply possessing knowledge could attach a supernatural entity to your existence, would you stop listening right now? Or do you keep listening because you need to know what happens next? Because the fear itself is what is holding you captive? Tell me in the comments. Tell me I'm not alone. Story 5. Demonic Pact of the Hellhound Master. The dogs tore through the fence without slowing down. I watched them come through the rotting wood like it was paper, their red eyes cutting through the darkness like laser beams, their massive frames moving with an impossible coordination that made my survival instinct scream warnings I couldn't process fast enough. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. I couldn't count. I was too busy running. My name is Marcus. I am 52 years old. I am a real estate appraiser. I spend my days measuring houses, estimating values, filling out paperwork. I am the kind of person who sees the world in terms of square footage and market trends. I am cautious. I am careful. I calculate risk before I act. None of that mattered when those animals came at me through the darkness on the edge of old Mrs. Henriksen's property. I'd been hired to assess a piece of land about 15 miles outside of Salem, Oregon. A developer wanted to buy the property and build a residential community. The land had been abandoned for decades, sitting empty except for the crumbling foundation of a house that had burned down in the 1970s. The location was remote, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense forest. The price was right, which meant something was wrong. That is usually how these things work. You get offered a property at a price that is too good to be true, and it is because the property itself is deeply, fundamentally wrong in some way that the listing agent hasn't disclosed. I arrived at the property on a Friday afternoon in October. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I parked my car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and got out to walk the perimeter. I needed to understand the boundaries, the acreage, the condition of the soil. I needed to understand why someone would sell this land so cheaply. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt it, a change in the atmosphere, a weight, like walking through invisible cobwebs. The air got colder, the birds stopped singing, even the wind seemed to die. The forest around me went silent in a way that suggested something significant had shifted. I told myself I was being paranoid. The property was obviously deserted. There was nothing here but overgrown grass and the remains of an old house. I pulled out my measuring equipment and started my work. As I was walking toward what used to be the main house, I noticed something odd. There were chains. Old iron chains embedded in concrete blocks scattered throughout the property. They were heavily corroded, clearly very old, but they were positioned with deliberate spacing. Regular intervals, like markers, like boundaries. I took pictures, I made notes, and I asked myself what those chains could possibly be for. They were too heavy for any normal purpose, too deliberately positioned for anything accidental. I was examining one of the chains more closely when I noticed the bones. They were scattered in the tall grass near the chain. Animal bones. I knelt down to examine them more carefully. They were large bones, the bones of something substantial. A deer, maybe, or a large dog. They were old, bleached white by years of sun exposure, but they were arranged in a pattern, not natural, deliberately arranged, with the bones of what looked like smaller animals positioned around the larger bones in a specific configuration. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up and looked around the property with new eyes. I could see more bone arrangements now, scattered throughout the overgrown field. Circles of bones, spirals of bones, patterns that hurt to look at because they suggested intention. Ceremony, ritual. I pulled out my phone and searched the address. What I found made my hands start to shake. The property had belonged to a man named Gerald Henriksen. He owned the land from 1942 until his death in 1971. Gerald Henriksen had been a recluse. He lived alone on this property, and according to newspaper accounts from the time, he bred dogs. Massive, aggressive dogs. German shepherds mixed with other large breeds. Dogs that were known for their viciousness. Local people had warned others away from the property. They said Henriksen treated his dogs like they were demons. They said he never took them into town, never let them interact with people. They said he'd been heard at night, speaking to the dogs in a language that didn't sound like English. They said he was conducting some kind of ritual. Then in 1971, there had been a fire. The main house had burned down. When firefighters arrived, they found Gerald Henriksen inside, dead. The cause was listed as accidental fire. The dogs had all disappeared. The property had been abandoned ever since. But the most disturbing part of the newspaper accounts was a rumor. A local legend. People who lived near the property claimed that Henriksen had made a pact. A deal with something dark? The rumor was that he'd given something up in exchange for the dogs becoming his eternal guardians. That even after his death, after the fire, the dogs remained. Phantom dogs, hellhounds, creatures that weren't quite alive but weren't quite dead either. No one had ever approached the property after that. The land had sat vacant, too haunted, too dangerous, too corrupted by whatever ritual Henriksen had performed. I should have left. I should have gotten back in my car and driven away and told the developer that the land was unsuitable, that there was something wrong that money couldn't fix. But I didn't. I was fascinated. And I was skeptical. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in demons or pacts or supernatural guardians. I believed in facts and measurements and things that could be verified. I continued my assessment. I measured the property. I documented the condition of the soil. I photographed the scattered bones and the chains, though I didn't put those photographs in my official report. I worked until the sun set completely, until darkness fell over the property like a blanket. And that is when I heard the howling. It came from multiple directions. Not distant, close, very close. The sound of massive dogs announcing their presence. The sound was wrong, though. The howl had a quality that no living animal should have. It was too deep, too resonant, too much. I walked back toward my car, moving faster than I had been walking before. The howling followed me. It seemed to be circling me. Getting closer, I could feel the presence of something large moving through the tall grass. Multiple somethings, moving with purpose and intelligence. I reached my car and got inside. I locked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands shaking, listening to the howling continue outside. The sound was circling my vehicle now, circling and circling, like something was evaluating me, deciding what to do with me. Then I saw them. They emerged from the darkness on all sides of my car. 3 massive dogs, but they weren't quite right. Their eyes were glowing, actually glowing, a deep red color that didn't match the reflective glow of normal animal eyes. These eyes were luminous, demonic, the eyes of creatures that didn't belong to this world. Their fur was matted and strange. Their bodies were too thin, like their skin was barely containing whatever was inside them. They moved with a coordination that was unnatural. They moved like they were one creature split into three bodies. They began to circle my car. I started the engine and threw it into reverse. I was going to back out onto the road, back away from this property, back away from whatever was keeping Gerald Henriksen, this domain, sealed and guarded. One of the dogs lunged at my windshield. I felt the impact like a collision. The glass didn't break, but I heard the scrape of claws against metal. I was accelerating now, driving in reverse down the overgrown driveway, my eyes fixed on the mirror where I could see those red eyes following me. I made it to the road and turned toward town. I drove for about 5 minutes before I looked in my mirror and saw them. The dogs were following me, running along the road, keeping pace with my car. Their red eyes were still glowing. They weren't tiring. They weren't stopping. I pressed the accelerator harder. I was doing 70 miles per hour now on a road that probably had a 50 mile per hour limit. The dogs matched my speed. They were keeping up. They were running alongside my car with their heads level with the windows, and I could see their teeth. I could see the foam coming from their mouths. I could see the hunger in their glowing red eyes. I drove like that for another mile before I realized something terrifying. I was approaching the town. The lights of Salem were getting closer. The inhabited world was getting closer, and the dogs were still following me. They weren't stopping at any boundary. They were chasing me past the edge of the property, following me toward populated areas, pursuing me past the point where they should have stopped. I drove faster. I was panicking now. My rational mind was shutting down, replaced by pure survival instinct. I could see the first buildings of the town. I could see streetlights. I could see other cars on the road ahead. And then the dogs were gone. I looked in my mirror and they simply vanished. One moment they were there, running alongside my car, their red eyes cutting through the darkness. The next moment they were gone. The road behind me was empty. The darkness was just darkness. I pulled over on the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, just trying to process what had happened. I drove to the police station. I told them about the dogs. I told them about the property. I told them about the red eyes and the unnatural behavior. The police officers listened to my account with expressions that suggested they thought I was either lying or having some kind of mental episode. They asked if I'd been drinking. They asked if I had a history of anxiety or panic attacks. One officer, a woman named Detective Sarah Chen, walked me outside to my car. She told me something that made everything worse. That property, she said quietly, is off limits. Officially off limits. The city has a standing order that no one is allowed to conduct business there. They had incidents. People who got onto that land and reported things. Supernatural things. We don't officially acknowledge the stories, but we enforce the boundary. That land stays empty for a reason. What kind of incidents? I asked. The kind that don't make sense, she said. People claiming they were chased by animals that shouldn't exist. People having accidents right after they leave the property. People reporting that they kept hearing howling even after they left the area. Sound like anything you experienced? I felt my stomach drop. How long has this been going on? Since at least the 1970s, Detective Chen said. Probably longer. There are stories in this town about Gerald Henriksen and his dogs. Stories that parents tell their children to keep them away from that property. The stories say he made a deal. That he traded something to ensure his dogs would guard his property forever. Traded what? I asked. No one knows, Detective Chen said. But whatever it was, it worked. Those dogs are still there, still guarding that land, still attacking anyone who gets too close. I drove back to my hotel that night and didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the town around me, waiting for howling that didn't come. In the morning, I called my office and told them I couldn't complete the assessment. I told them the property was unsuitable. I didn't give them details. I just said it was too dangerous. I packed my belongings and drove out of Salem. But here, this is the terrifying part. That was 3 weeks ago. And I'm still hearing the howling. It comes at night, different locations. Sometimes I hear it when I am at home in Portland. Sometimes I hear it when I am in my car. Sometimes I hear it when I am at other properties, doing other assessments. The sound of those massive dogs. The sound of something calling to me across the distance. Calling me back to that property. Calling me back to finish what I started. And I am starting to wonder if the dogs didn't stop chasing me. I am starting to wonder if they were still following me, but at a distance I can only perceive through sound. I am starting to wonder if I brought something back with me from that property. Some kind of mark, some kind of connection. I researched more about Gerald Henriksen. I found old records. He didn't just breed dogs. He performed rituals, documented rituals. He was part of an occult group that believed in binding spirits to physical locations. He believed he could create eternal guardians, creatures that would exist between life and death, creatures that would serve him forever. The fire that killed him might not have been accidental. It might have been part of the ritual, a sacrifice, a sealing, a way to bind the dogs to the property even after his death. But something went wrong, or something went right, depending on how you look at it. The dogs didn't just stay on the property. They developed awareness. They developed hunger. They started reaching beyond the boundaries that Henriksen had set. They started hunting. They started pursuing people. They started spreading. And I'm wondering how many other people they marked. How many other people have heard the howling? How many other people are lying awake at night, waiting for those red eyes to appear in the darkness? The howling is getting closer. I can feel it. The dogs are coming for me. And I'm not sure if I'm going to survive long enough to understand what they want. But I know one thing for certain. Those dogs didn't come from anywhere natural. They came from somewhere dark, somewhere wrong, somewhere that shouldn't exist in our world but does. And if you ever find yourself on that property in Salem, Oregon, if you ever cross the invisible boundary that Gerald Henriksen established, if you ever encounter those dogs with the red eyes, remember one thing. You can't outrun them. You can't hide from them. The only thing you can do is pray that you reach close enough to populated areas that their pack doesn't, to allow them to chase you all the way to safety. Because if you alone when you encounter them, if you truly isolated, those phantom hounds will have you. And they'll become one more story, one more warning, one more name whispered in Salem about the people who went to that property and never came back the same. So here, it's my question for you. If you ever encounter something genuinely supernatural and evil, something that defies everything you believe in, would you have the courage to report it to authorities and seek help? Or would you try to handle it alone? Write your answer in the comments, because I'm genuinely wondering if reaching out for help made my situation better or worse. Story 6. Terrifying transformation of the Barkskin Man. I can hear him in the forest right now, and he is made of trees. My name is David, and I'm 41 years old. I am a forester for the United States Forest Service, stationed in Oregon, managing timber resources across thousands of acres of Pacific Northwest wilderness. I know these forests better than I know my own home. I can identify every species of tree, every type of soil, every pattern the animals follow. I thought that knowledge would protect me. I was catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. This started about 6 months ago when I was surveying a remote section of the Cascade Range, marking trees for harvest in an area that hadn't been logged in decades. The wilderness there is pristine, untouched, the kind of place where you can go an entire day without seeing any sign of human civilization. I was documenting the timber density and making notes about which trees were ready for harvest when I found something that didn't belong in that forest. A cabin, not recently built, but not ancient either, probably 30 or 40 years old, made from logs that were blackened with age and weather. The structure was barely standing, the roof partially collapsed, the windows shattered and gaping like empty eye sockets. There was no record of this cabin in our Forest Service database. No permits, no registration, no indication that anyone had ever lived there legally. I approached cautiously. The door was hanging open, revealing darkness inside that seemed to absorb the daylight. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a space that had been abandoned for years. There was furniture, overturned and rotted. There were clothes scattered across the floor, so degraded they were barely recognizable as cloth anymore. And there were drawings, hundreds of them, covering every wall surface. The drawings were disturbing, not artistic or creative, but obsessive and repetitive. They showed human figures transforming into trees, their arms becoming branches, their skin becoming bark, their bodies twisted and contorted into impossible shapes. Some of the drawings showed the human figures being absorbed by the trees entirely, disappearing into the wood. Others showed trees with human faces screaming from within their trunks. The most unsettling drawing showed a figure that was part human and part tree, standing in the center of a forest with people trapped inside the surrounding trees. Their faces visible in the wood, their expressions frozen in horror. I should have left immediately. Something about that cabin screamed danger and instability. But I was curious, and I was also concerned. Someone had lived here, someone who was clearly experiencing severe psychological disturbance. I wanted to know who, and I wanted to know what had happened to them. So I searched the cabin more thoroughly, looking for documents, for identification, for anything that could tell me who had created this disturbing shrine to transformation and vengeance. I found a journal in what appeared to be a bedroom area, hidden beneath floorboards that had partially rotted away. The journal was water-damaged and difficult to read, but I managed to piece together the story of the person who lived in that cabin. His name was Samuel Lockwood. He'd been a teacher in a small town called Millbrook, which was about 15 miles away from the cabin. According to the journal entries, the townspeople had accused him of inappropriate conduct with a student. The accusations were false, or at least that's what Samuel claimed in his journal entries. He insisted he'd been framed by a student who had a vendetta against him. But the townspeople didn't investigate carefully. They just formed a mob, forced him out of town, burned his house, and threatened to kill him if he ever returned. Samuel retreated to the forest and lived in isolation for 20 years. According to his journal, he spent those years studying folk magic, learning ancient rituals and incantations from old books he salvaged from abandoned homesteads and archaeological sites. He became convinced that he could transform himself, could merge with the forest itself, could become something more powerful than human. He could become vengeance embodied. The final journal entry was dated approximately 6 months before I found the cabin. It described a ritual, a complex ceremony where Samuel would use folk magic and sacrifice to transform his body into wood and bark, merging his consciousness with the forest itself. He would become one with the trees, and from that state, he would take his revenge on the townspeople who had wronged him. The entry ended with a single line: "When the transformation is complete, they will understand what they did. The forest will show them their sins, and the trees will hold them until they repent or until they die." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those final words. I told myself that Samuel was just a disturbed man who had written fiction in his journal, fantasizing about revenge but lacking the means or capacity to actually execute it. I told myself that folk magic didn't work, that you couldn't actually transform yourself into a tree, that this was all the paranoid delusions of someone suffering from severe mental illness. But I knew, even then, that I didn't quite believe that. There was something about the cabin, something about the drawings and the ritual descriptions, that suggested Samuel had actually attempted the transformation. And I was standing in the evidence of that attempt. I left the cabin and continued my survey work, but my mind was troubled. I decided that I would investigate this situation further, so I made a trip into Millbrook to see if I could find any information about Samuel Lockwood. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, the kind of place where everyone would know the history of a major scandal from decades ago. I went to the local diner and started asking casual questions about Samuel Lockwood. The reactions were immediate and disturbing. The waitress, whose face went pale. The other patrons stopped talking and stared at me. The owner came out from the kitchen and asked me to leave immediately. He said that Samuel Lockwood's name wasn't too welcome in that town, that what had happened was best left in the past, and that asking about it would cause unnecessary pain to the families involved. But before they could force me out, one of the older men in the diner, someone who looked like he lived in Millbrook his entire life, pulled me aside. He told me, in a very quiet voice, that Samuel Lockwood had been innocent. The student who accused him had eventually recanted the claim, admitted she lied out of revenge because Samuel had given her a failing grade. But by that time, Samuel was already gone, driven into the forest by the mob. The town had tried to find him to apologize, but he disappeared completely. The old man told me something else. He said that over the past few months, some of the townspeople who had been part of the original mob had started disappearing. Not dying, exactly, but vanishing into the forest. Search parties had found them, but they were always in the same state, standing in the middle of groups of twisted, gnarled trees, unable to move, unable to speak, their bodies partially merged with the wood. They were still alive, but they were also somehow part of the forest, trapped between human and tree, conscious but completely immobilized. The old man suggested that I not go back into that forest alone. He suggested that whatever Samuel Lockwood had become, it was still seeking revenge, and it was finding those who wronged him. He told me to tell my superiors what I discovered and to have the cabin sealed and the area cordoned off. I should have listened to that old man. Instead, I went back into the forest. I told myself it was to document the cabin properly and report it to the appropriate authorities. But the truth was that I was fascinated, drawn by the mystery of what had actually happened to Samuel Lockwood. Desperate to understand if transformation through folk magic was actually possible. When I reached the cabin the next day, I discovered that something had changed. The drawings on the walls had multiplied. There were hundreds of new sketches, all depicting different transformations, different variations on the human form merging with wood and bark. And in the center of the main room, there was a crude altar made from branches and twisted wood, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. That's when the forest around me started to move. The trees began to shift and twist, their trunks contorting into shapes that were biologically impossible. They bent toward me, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. The bark on their trunks rippled like skin, and I could see faces forming in the wood, faces of people twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I ran. I didn't hesitate, just ran as fast as I could away from the cabin and toward the direction I believed was the forest road. But the forest was working against me. The trees were moving deliberately, creating barriers where there had been open paths moments before. Roots erupted from the ground to trip me. Branches whipped down to strike me. And all around me, I could hear a sound like wind, but more deliberate, more intentional, more like breathing. I finally managed to break through the forest and reach my truck. I drove away from that area at reckless speed, half expecting the trees to somehow reach out and pull me back into the wilderness. I made it to the ranger station and reported everything to my supervisor. I told him about the cabin, about Samuel Lockwood, about the people trapped in the trees. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He sent a team to investigate. What they found was a cabin that appeared to be at least 50 years abandoned, with no signs of recent occupation. The drawings on the walls were faded and water-damaged, barely visible. The altar I'd seen so clearly was gone, replaced by nothing but rotted wood and forest debris. The team found no evidence of people trapped in trees or of any supernatural activity. But they did find something in the forest near the cabin. A set of remains, skeletal and partially decomposed, buried beneath a massive oak tree. The forensics team identified them as belonging to Samuel Lockwood, who had been missing since his disappearance 40 years ago. The coroner concluded that he died of natural causes sometime in the early 1980s, probably from malnutrition and illness, living alone in the forest. They concluded that the cabin was a product of his deteriorating mental state, that the drawings and the ritual descriptions were just the fantasies of someone suffering from severe psychosis, isolated and alone in the wilderness. They suggested that I'd been affected by the disturbing nature of the cabin, that my mind had created supernatural explanations for mundane evidence of human suffering. I wanted to believe that explanation. I wanted to convince myself that what I experienced in the forest was just stress and imagination and the power of suggestion. But I knew what I felt. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew that the transformation described in Samuel's journal wasn't fantasy. Over the next month, people from Millbrook started disappearing. Not all of them, just the ones who had been part of the original mob that had driven Samuel from town. The search parties found them in the forest, standing among twisted, contorted trees, their bodies beginning to merge with the wood. They were still conscious, still aware, still trapped in unimaginable agony as their bodies slowly transformed, their flesh becoming bark, their blood becoming sap, their humanity being absorbed into the forest itself. The authorities tried to cut the trees down, but the moment a tree was felled, the person merged with that tree would experience catastrophic internal injuries, as if cutting the wood was cutting their body. The transformation couldn't be stopped. It could only be endured, slowly, agonizingly, over weeks or months as the human consciousness was gradually absorbed into the forest's ancient, patient wisdom. I've been having nightmares since then. In every dream, I'm standing in the forest, and I can feel my skin beginning to harden, beginning to crack like bark. I can feel my limbs becoming stiff and woody. I can feel my consciousness starting to merge with something vast and old and terrifyingly patient. And I know, with absolute certainty, that this isn't just a dream. Samuel Lockwood is still out there, still transforming, still enacting his vengeance. and he is starting to see me as part of his target. The transformations have accelerated. 7 people from Millbrook are now partially merged with trees. The authorities have cordoned off the forest, declared it a danger zone, but they don't understand what is actually happening. They think it is some kind of environmental toxin, maybe spores from infected fungi causing hallucinations and psychological delusions. They don't understand that Samuel Lockwood, this transformation wasn't a failure. It was a complete success. He became one with the forest, and now the forest is his instrument of vengeance. The most terrifying part is that I can feel him, even when I'm nowhere near the forest. Even when I am in town or at home or at the ranger station, I can feel his presence. I can feel his consciousness probing at the edges of mine, studying me, deciding if I'm worthy of punishment or if I should be spared. I know that he remembers me finding his cabin, remembers me documenting his drawings in his journal. He is deciding what to do with me. Every night, I check my skin to see if it has begun to harden into bark. Every morning, I'm relieved to find it is still normal, still human, still mine. But I know that relief is temporary. Samuel Lockwood is patient. He has nothing but time, and the forest is his body now. He can wait decades if necessary for me to return to his woods. And eventually, inevitably, I will have to return. My job requires me to survey those forests. My duty demands that I continue my work. And when I do return, when I walk back into those twisted, transformed trees, I know what will happen. I'll feel the transformation beginning. I'll feel my body merging with the wood, feel my consciousness being absorbed into something ancient and vast. And I'll join all the others, standing in the center of gnarled, impossible trees, my face visible in the bark, my awareness complete but my body no longer my own. Samuel Lockwood has succeeded in becoming one with the forest, and now he is slowly, methodically, turning the forest into an instrument of his revenge, transforming everyone who wronged him into permanent parts of the landscape. It's taking an eternity to enact his vengeance, but he is patient. He has all the time in the world. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to understand what is really happening in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I need someone to know that folk magic is real, that transformations are possible, that a deeply wronged person with sufficient desperation and knowledge can fundamentally alter their own nature and weaponize the natural world against those who harm them. Stay out of the deep forests, to investigate old cabins or abandoned structures in the wilderness. And if you ever feel the forest shifting around you, if you ever see trees beginning to twist and contort into impossible shapes, run. To look back. To try to understand. Just run, because the bark skin man is still collecting his vengeance, and he is far from finished. I can hear him now, in the trees outside my window. I can hear the sound of wood creaking and groaning, branches reaching toward my house. He has decided it is time. My transformation is beginning. I can feel my skin starting to harden, feel my body beginning to merge with something ancient and patient and terribly, terribly hungry. This is my final confession. This is my warning. In a few days, I'll be gone, absorbed into the forest, my consciousness trapped but aware inside the wood. And all the others who wronged Samuel Lockwood will still be out there, standing in their twisted prisons, waiting for the slow, endless eons of their transformation to complete. So here is my question for you, listener. If you discovered that magic was real, that a wronged person could use it to take literally eternal revenge, would you try to stop them? Or would you recognize that they already won, that the damage is already done, and that some transformations can never be undone? Tell me in the comments, because I'm running out of time, and I need to know that someone understands what Samuel Lockwood has become, and why no one can ever stop him. Story 7. Spectral Noose of the Hanging Tree. I woke up choking. My hands flew to my throat, searching desperately for the rope that was crushing my windpipe, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could touch or grab or fight against. Just the unbearable, suffocating sensation of invisible fibers digging into my neck, cutting off my air, pulling me toward darkness. I thrashed in my sleeping bag, gasping, my lungs burning with the need for oxygen that wouldn't come. And then, as suddenly as it started, the pressure released. I collapsed to the ground, coughing violently, my heart racing so fast I thought I might have a heart attack. That's when I heard the crowd. They were cheering, hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all roaring with excitement and bloodlust. I scrambled out of my tent and looked around my campsite, but I was alone. Completely, utterly alone in a remote section of forest in Mississippi, miles from the nearest town. Yet the crowd's roar continued, echoing through the trees as if the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The voices were celebrating something, someone, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that they were celebrating my death. I threw my belongings into my truck as fast as my shaking hands could manage and drove away from that cursed camping spot at 3 a.m. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town with streetlights and people and the reassuring signs of civilization. I pulled into an all-night diner, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and sat in a booth for hours, trying to process what had happened. Trying to convince myself that it had been a nightmare, a panic attack, a hallucination brought on by anxiety and exhaustion. But the rope burns on my neck were real. I could feel them every time my fingers touched my skin. 4 parallel lines, perfectly spaced, running horizontally across my throat as if hands had recently tried to strangle me. Or as if a noose had been tightened around my neck and then mysteriously released at the last possible moment. The burns didn't fade over the next few hours. They didn't diminish. They intensified, turning dark red, almost purple, visible enough that the waitress at the diner started asking concerned questions about whether I was okay. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to describe what had happened in that forest without sounding absolutely insane. So I paid my bill and drove to the nearest urgent care clinic, where a nurse examined my neck and looked genuinely confused. She told me that the marks looked like rope burns or strangulation injuries, but they appeared to be at least 12 to 24 hours old based on the discoloration pattern. She asked me if I'd been assaulted. She asked if I needed to file a police report. She looked skeptical when I said I had no idea how the injuries had occurred. I knew I needed to find out what had happened at that camping site. I needed to understand why I experienced something so terrifying, so impossible, something that had left physical evidence on my body. I started researching the area, looking for information about that particular section of forest. I found nothing at first. It was just unincorporated land, state forest, a place where people camped and hunted and fished without any particular history or significance. Then I found the old forum post. It was on an obscure paranormal website, dated to 1998, written by someone using the screen name Darkwalker1970. The post described a camping trip to the same location where I experienced my nightmare. The author described waking up in the night gasping for air, with marks on their neck that looked like rope burns. The author described hearing a phantom crowd cheering in the darkness. The author described a feeling of absolute dread, of standing at the edge of death, of being saved by something or someone in the last possible moment before losing consciousness. There were other posts in the thread, dozens of them, all describing similar experiences, all from different years, all from different people. Some of the accounts dated back to the 1970s. Some were from just a few years ago. Every single account mentioned the rope burns. Every single account mentioned the crowd. Every single account mentioned the terrifying sensation of being hanged, of choking, of approaching death from an invisible force. One post, from someone calling themselves Survival West, described the history. The poster claimed that the area had been the site of lynchings during the Jim Crow era. Multiple victims had been hanged from a specific tree, an enormous oak that had stood in that location for over 200 years. The tree had eventually died and fallen over, but its massive trunk still lay on the ground, and locals called it the hanging tree. The poster claimed that people who camped too close to the tree reported the terrifying, disturbing experiences I just endured. I needed to see the tree for myself. I know that sounds insane. Most reasonable people would say that I should avoid that location entirely, that I should stay as far away from it as possible. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand what had happened. I needed to know if the nightmare was real or if I somehow imagined the entire thing. And I needed to know why the rope burns on my neck weren't fading. I drove back to Mississippi 3 days later. I parked my truck near the forest entrance and hiked deeper into the woods, following the directions from the forum posts. It took me about 40 minutes of careful searching, but I found it. The hanging tree. It was massive, even fallen, even dead for who knows how long. The oak tree was enormous. The trunk was at least 8 feet in diameter, Ancient wood turned gray and weathered. The tree lay on its side, its root system exposed like the skeleton of some prehistoric creature. But what made the tree truly horrifying was what I saw carved into the wood. Names, hundreds of them, maybe more, carved into the bark with what must have been tremendous effort over many years. Some names were fresh, barely weathered. Some were so old they were barely legible. Names of victims, names of people who had been murdered at this location. Names carved into the tree by people who remembered, people who wanted to ensure that the dead weren't forgotten. People who understood that this tree was a monument to horror. I traced my fingers over some of the names. Samuel Jackson, Margaret Williams, James Addison, Thomas Freeman. Children, this names alongside adults. Families, entire lines of people erased from official records but remembered here, carved into the wood of the tree that had killed them. The emotional weight of it was overwhelming. The injustice, the cruelty, the deliberate erasure from history. I sat at the base of the tree for hours. I didn't plan to sleep. I didn't plan to be there after dark. But the emotional intensity of the place, the weight of the history, the presence of so many dead kept me rooted to that spot. As the sun began to set, I realized I waited too long. Night was falling, and I was still at the hanging tree. I should have left immediately. I should have run back to my truck. But some part of me wanted to understand. Some part of me wanted to experience the horror directly, to understand what those phantom voices were, why they were trapped in this location, what they wanted from the living people who dared to camp near their grave. I built a small fire as darkness fell completely. I stayed close to the light, telling myself that the flames would protect me, that the fire would keep the darkness at bay. I was wrong about everything. The sound started around midnight. Whispers at first, so faint I could barely hear them. Then conversations, overlapping and indistinct. Then voices raised in anger, in excitement, in hatred. The phantom crowd was gathering. I could feel their presence. Hundreds of spectral entities assembling in the darkness around the hanging tree. They weren't attacking me. They were preparing. They were getting ready to perform their horrifying ritual again. The voices began chanting. I couldn't understand the words at first, but gradually the chant became clear. It was a count, numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, going higher and higher, 10, 20, 50. The numbers continued to climb, and with each number, I felt the spiritual noose tightening around my neck. The phantom crowd was counting up to something. They were counting up to a number that represented the total deaths that had occurred at this tree. They were counting their victims. When the count reached 97, the chanting stopped. The phantom crowd had fallen silent, and then the noose pulled tight. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do anything but experience the absolute horror of what it felt like to die the way those 97 people had died. The rope digging into my flesh, the pressure in my head building as blood couldn't flow, my vision tunneling, my consciousness fragmenting, the sensation of dangling above the earth, my feet kicking at nothing, my body convulsing in its final death throes. I was experiencing their deaths. I was feeling their suffering. I was being made to understand the horror that had been inflicted on these people. I didn't know how long the noose was tightened around my neck. My sense of time dissolved in those final seconds before consciousness slipped away. But somehow, at the very last moment, when I was at the absolute threshold of death, the pressure released. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, my body convulsing, my throat raw from the pressure. The phantom crowd began to fade. The voices grew distant. The spiritual presence that had been so overwhelming began to dissipate. As the night grew quiet again, I understood something terrifying. The crowd hadn't been trying to kill me. They'd been showing me. They'd been forcing me to witness what they experienced. They'd been making me understand. I staggered back to my truck and drove away from that cursed place. But I knew, even as I was driving, that I wasn't free. The experience of the noose, the sensation of dying the way those 97 people had died, would stay with me forever. The rope burns on my neck would eventually fade, but the psychological wounds would never heal. I've done months of research since that night. I've found records, historical documents, newspaper archives about the lynchings that occurred at that location. The official count is lower, about 63 documented victims, but the phantom crowd had counted 97. I believe the missing 34 represent victims whose deaths were never recorded, whose names were erased from history, whose suffering was deemed unworthy of documentation. The hanging tree remembers them. The spirits at that place remember them. And now I remember them too. I then learned that I'm not the only person who has experienced this horror. I've connected with dozens of other people online, people who have camped near the hanging tree and experienced the same terrifying nightmare. We compared notes, discussed our experiences, shared our rope burns with photographs that shocked and disturbed us all. They realized that we read part of something bigger, a pattern that extends back decades, maybe longer. What disturbs me most is this realization. The hanging tree is trying to educate the living. It's trying to force people to bear witness to what happened there. It is trying to prevent the victims from being forgotten. The 97 people who died at that location are using the only power they have left, the power to haunt, the power to terrify, to ensure that their stories are told. They started a website. They documented the names carved into the tree. They compiled the historical records. They gathered testimonies from people who have experienced the phantom noose. They created a memorial to the 97 people who died at that cursed location. Some people think I am obsessed. Some people think I'm traumatized and fixating on my trauma. But I believe that the spirits want this information shared. I believe they reaching out through me to a wider audience. The hanging tree still stands in Mississippi. The massive oak still lies on its side, still has the names carved into its wood. People still camp near it, still experience the rope burns, still hear the phantom crowd. I believe the haunting will continue indefinitely, until the victims receive proper recognition, until their stories are taught in schools, until America acknowledges the systematic terror that was inflicted on Black Americans for centuries. The spectral noose is real. It exists at that location, and it reaches out to anyone who dares to camp too close to the hanging tree. The rope burns are real. The phantom crowd is real. The 97 deaths are real. And the weight of that history, the responsibility to remember, is something that now haunts me every single night. I sleep with my lights on. I keep my neck covered because I can, to bear to see the permanent marks that have remained from that night. I live with the knowledge that I have experienced something most people will never experience, something horrifying and unjust and necessary. I live with the understanding that the dead refuse to be forgotten, and they will haunt the living until justice is finally served. Here, it's my question for you, and I need you to answer honestly in the comments. If you experienced something as horrifying as the phantom noose, if you were forced to bear witness to historical atrocities and given the power to share that knowledge with the world, would you accept the burden of that responsibility? Or would you try to forget it and move on? Tell me you have the courage to remember. Story 8. Monstrous hybrid of the inbred hollow. The thing that killed my dog wasn't human, but it wore human skin like an ill-fitting coat. I need you to understand that right from the start, because everything that happened afterward, everything I'm about to tell you, hinges on that single, horrifying truth. What I encountered in Kettle Hollow wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or some other rational explanation my mind could accept. It was something that should never have existed. Something born from isolation and desperation and bloodlines that had twisted back on themselves too many times. My name is David Foster. I am a wildlife biologist with the Forest Service, 46 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years studying predator populations in the Appalachian Mountains. I am not prone to panic. I don't believe in monsters. Or at least I didn't until last November when I was sent to investigate livestock killings in a remote valley of eastern Kentucky. Kettle Hollow. The name alone should have warned me. The locals in the nearest town, a place called Harlan Springs about 15 miles away, wouldn't talk about it. When I asked for directions at the general store, the woman behind the counter just shook her head and told me to leave well enough alone. Said that Hollow had been trouble for generations, that the family up there didn't take kindly to strangers, and that animals sometimes disappeared in those woods for reasons that had nothing to do with natural predators. But I had a job to do. 3 farms on the outskirts of the Hollow had lost livestock over the past 2 months. Sheep mostly, but also chickens, goats, and one farmer whose prize bull. The kills were brutal, messy, not the clean work of wolves or coyotes. Something was tearing these animals apart with savage violence, leaving pieces scattered across pastures like a child's tantrum. I drove up into Kettle Hollow on a gray November morning with my gear, my government SUV, and my German Shepherd, Rex. The road deteriorated quickly from paved to gravel to barely a dirt track, winding through dense forest that seemed to close in from both sides. The trees here were old growth, massive oaks and hickories that blocked out most of the sunlight even at midday. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. About 6 miles in, I passed a property that made my skin crawl. A sagging farmhouse surrounded by rusted car husks and broken farm equipment. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows. But I had the overwhelming sense of being watched. Rex growled low in his chest, the hair on his back standing up. I kept driving. The hollow opened up into a small valley maybe a mile beyond that farmhouse. A creek ran through the center, and scattered along its banks were 3 more properties in various states of decay. This was where the livestock attacks had occurred. I parked near the first farm and spent the afternoon examining kill sites, taking samples, looking for tracks. What I found didn't make sense. The tracks were humanoid but wrong. Too large, the stride too long, and the claw marks on the dead animals showed 5 digits, like fingers, but with nails that had gouged through hide and bone. No known predator in North America left marks like these. As the sun began to set, I set up a trail camera near one of the farms where attacks had been most frequent. The farmer, an old man named Jessup who watched me with suspicious, rheumy eyes, warned me not to be in the hollow after dark. Said things moved through these woods at night that didn't belong. Said his grandfather had warned his father, and his father had warned him, and now he was warning me. I thanked him for his concern and told him I'd be fine. I had Rex. I had a rifle. I spent hundreds of nights in the wilderness. What could possibly happen? I should have listened. I drove back down the dirt track intending to return to Harlan Springs for the night, but my SUV died about 2 miles from the valley. Just stopped, like something had pulled the plug on the engine. The battery was dead. The lights wouldn't turn on. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains, but the complete electrical failure was strange. Rex whined nervously in the back seat. I grabbed my flashlight, my rifle, and my emergency pack, and decided to hike back to the nearest farmhouse to ask for help. It was only 2 miles. I'd done far longer hikes in worse conditions. But as I walked, as the darkness settled over Kettle Hollow like a suffocating blanket, I began to feel that I was being followed. Not just watched, followed. I could hear something moving through the trees parallel to the road, pacing me, staying just out of sight. Rex stayed close to my legs, his ears flat against his head, his tail tucked. The sounds weren't right. The footfalls were too heavy for a deer, too irregular for a bear. And there was breathing, harsh, raspy breathing that sounded almost human but with a wet, congested quality that made my stomach turn. I quickened my pace. The thing in the trees matched me. When I stopped to listen, it stopped. When I started moving again, it resumed its pursuit. Always there, always just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. That is when Rex bolted. One moment he was pressed against my leg, trembling. The next he was gone, charging into the darkness with a snarl. I called after him, but he didn't stop, didn't come back. I heard him barking, then growling, then a yelp that cut off mid-sound. Then silence. I ran toward where I heard him, crashing through underbrush, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. I found him 30 feet off the road, lying in a patch of trampled ferns. His neck was broken, twisted at an angle that made me want to vomit. But worse than that, worse than losing my dog, was what I saw in the beam of my flashlight beyond his body. Footprints, human-shaped but massive, at least 18 inches long, 5 toes but the proportions were wrong. The big toe offset at an angle no human foot would have. And leading away from Rex's body, a trail of prints heading deeper into the hollow. I backed away slowly, my rifle raised, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever had killed Rex was still close. I could feel it, could hear that wet, labored breathing somewhere in the darkness. I made it back to the road and ran. Didn't care about the noise. Didn't care about dignity. Just ran through the night with the sound of something large crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer with each second. The first farmhouse I passed earlier, the decrepit one that had made my skin crawl, appeared out of the darkness. I didn't want to go there. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, but the thing behind me was too close, too fast. I wasn't going to outrun it. I burst through the front door, which wasn't locked, and slammed it behind me. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and something else, something animal. I fumbled for my flashlight and the beam revealed a nightmare. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. Bones hung from the ceiling on strings. Animal bones mostly, but some that looked disturbingly human. And covering every surface were photographs. Old black and white images of the same family, generation after generation. And with each generation, the faces became more distorted, more wrong. I could see the degradation in their features. Eyes too far apart, jaws that jutted at odd angles, fingers with too many joints. The photographic record of a family that had lived in isolation for so long, that had interbred so extensively, that their very biology had twisted into something that barely resembled humanity. The last photo showed a recent picture, a woman, gaunt and hollow-eyed, holding an infant. But the infant was grotesque, misshapen, its limbs too long, its head too large, its mouth filled with teeth that no baby should have. That's when I heard the breathing behind me. I spun around, my rifle raised, and my flashlight beam illuminated the thing standing in the doorway. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. Its skin was pale and loose, hanging off its frame like it had been made for a different body. The face was the worst part. It had human features, but they were arranged incorrectly, like a child, this drawing of a person. Eyes too far apart, a nose that was just 2 slits, a mouth that stretched nearly ear to ear, filled with mismatched teeth. It wore overalls that were torn and stained, human clothing on something that was only partially human, and it was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite anger, not quite curiosity, something primal and hungry and utterly alien. I fired. The rifle shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the thing in the chest, and it stumbled backward. But it didn't fall, didn't scream, just looked down at the wound with what might have been confusion, then looked back at me. And it smiled, a horrible, too wide smile that showed every one of those nightmare teeth. I ran deeper into the house, looking for another exit. I crashed through a kitchen where the smell of decay was overwhelming, past a bedroom where more photographs covered the walls, and finally found a back door. I burst through it into the night and kept running. Behind me, I could hear the thing pursuing. Its footfalls were uneven, a lurching gait that spoke of bones that didn't quite fit together correctly. But it was fast, terrifyingly fast. I ran through the forest with no plan, no direction, just raw survival instinct. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to trip me. And all the while, that thing was behind me, breathing its wet, rattling breaths, getting closer. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Time lost meaning in that nightmare chase through Kettle Hollow. But eventually, I saw lights ahead. The valley where I'd been earlier. The farms. I burst out of the tree line and ran toward the nearest house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. Old Jessup opened it, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. He slammed the door and threw the bolt, then turned to me with an expression that said he'd known this would happen. The thing didn't follow me to the house. I could hear it out there, circling in the darkness, but it didn't approach. Jessup told me it wouldn't. Said the family up in that hollow had a deal with the people in the valley. They kept their creature away from the farms, and the valley people didn't report what they knew. An arrangement that had held for 3 generations. He told me the story while I sat shaking at his kitchen table. The family in that hollow had been there since before the Civil War. Isolated by choice at first, then by necessity as their bloodline weakened. By the time anyone realized how bad it had gotten, it was too late. The last few generations had been born with severe deformities. Most didn't survive infancy, but one had. One child born 23 years ago that was more monster than human. Strong despite its malformations. Violent. Hungry. The family kept it hidden. Fed it livestock when they could. Locked it up when they couldn't. But sometimes it got out. Sometimes it hunted. And the people in the valley looked the other way because they were terrified of what might happen if they didn't. I left Kettle Hollow before dawn. Jessup drove me back to my SUV, which started without issue, and told me to report the livestock kills as coyote attacks. To never mention what I'd seen. To never come back. I filed my report exactly as he suggested. No one questioned it, but I haven't stopped thinking about what I saw in that hollow. About that creature that should never have existed, born from desperation and isolation and the inevitable consequences of a gene pool that ran too shallow. The Forest Service has me working in Montana now, far from Kentucky, far from Kettle Hollow, but I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, hearing that wet, rattling breathing, seeing that too wide smile filled with mismatched teeth. And I wonder how many other places like Kettle Hollow exist in the remote corners of America. How many other families living in isolation, their bloodlines twisted beyond recognition. How many other creatures born from that terrible arithmetic of genetics gone wrong. The thing that killed Rex is still out there, still hunting in those dark woods, and the people in the valley still look the other way. Because sometimes the cost of survival is knowing when to keep your mouth shut. So here, it's my question for you. If you stumbled across something that challenged everything you thought you knew about the natural world, something horrifying but undeniably real, would you report it? Would you try to help? Or would you do what I did and walk away, letting the horror continue because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate? Write your answer in the comments, because I'm still not sure I made the right choice. Story 9. Mutant abomination of the chemical spill. I found a deer with 6 legs still running through the forest. That is what made me understand that something was horrifyingly, fundamentally wrong. Not the abandoned chemical plant I discovered. Not the rusted tanks and the obviously contaminated soil. It was that deer, that mutated, wrongly constructed creature that shouldn't to exist in nature. That thing told me more about the creeping danger in these woods than any warning sign ever could. My name is Kevin. I am 51 years old. I am a wildlife photographer. I spend my life documenting nature, capturing images of animals in their natural habitats, selling my work to magazines and websites. I'm good at what I do. I know how to move through forests without disturbing the wildlife. I know how to read animal behavior. I know how to recognize when something is terribly, dangerously wrong with an ecosystem. I came to Blackwell Valley in eastern Kentucky because I heard rumors of undisturbed old-growth forests. I wanted to photograph black bears in their natural environment, maybe capture some images of bobcats or mountain lions if I was lucky. What I found instead was a hidden valley where nature itself had become twisted into nightmare shapes. I first noticed the contamination near my base camp. The soil had an odd color, gray in patches, almost like ash, mixed with soil that appeared stained by something chemical. The smell was wrong too. Not the fresh smell of forest earth in decomposition. This was acrid, sharp, the kind of smell that made your throat close up and your eyes water. I investigated. I followed the contamination upslope, tracking the source. And I found it. An old chemical plant, long abandoned, hidden in a depression in the valley. The facility was falling apart. Rusted tanks leaked their contents into the soil. Barrels lay on their sides, contents long since spilled into the ground and groundwater. There were no warning signs. No fencing. Nothing to indicate that this place existed or that it was poisoned. I recognized some of the tank labels. Compounds that had been banned decades ago. Agricultural chemicals. Industrial lubricants. Things designed to be carefully contained, never to touch living organisms. All of it now leaking into the soil and water of this valley. I took photographs. I documented the contamination. I told myself that I should report this to the Environmental Protection Agency, that I should make sure the world knew about this abandoned disaster. But I also decided to stay longer, to document what had happened to the ecosystem, to capture evidence of environmental destruction. I should have left immediately. That was my first mistake. Over the next 2 days, I started noticing the animals. Or rather, I started noticing how wrong they were. The birds were smaller than they should have been. The squirrels moved with an unusual gait. And then I saw the deer. It came through the forest about 50 yards from my camp. A doe, I thought at first. But as it got closer, I saw the wrongness. It had 6 legs, not 4, 6. The additional legs had sprouted from its sides at odd angles, creating a gait that was disturbing to watch. The creature moved in a way that suggested it was confused about how its own body worked. But that wasn't the scariest part. The scary part was that it was alive, that it was functioning, that whatever genetic damage the chemical contamination had caused, it wasn't instantly lethal. The animal had survived with these mutations, had adapted to them. That suggested the contamination was ongoing, that it was still changing things. I photographed the 6-legged deer. I documented its movement, and I felt a creeping sense of dread settle into my bones. That night, something killed one of the smaller animals near my camp. A rabbit, I think. I found it the next morning. It had been torn apart with shocking violence. The remains were scattered, but what disturbed me most was the size of the tracks around the kill site. The prints were too large, too deep. The pressure marks suggested something weighing several hundred pounds. I packed up my camp and moved to a different location, about a mile away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But I also checked my supply of bear spray. I also made sure I had a good knife on me. I also loaded extra batteries in my flashlight. On my third night in the valley, I heard the sounds. They came from deep in the forest, howling, but not quite like any animal howl you ever heard. The sound was layered, multiple tones creating a discordant chorus that made my teeth ache. The howling went on for what felt like hours, circling closer, then farther away, like whatever was making the sound was pacing through the forest, searching for something. I didn't. To sleep, I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, waiting for dawn. The howling eventually stopped around 3 a.m. The forest went silent. That silence was somehow worse than the noise. At first light, I investigated the source of the howling. I followed the tracks. What I found made my stomach turn. The tracks were massive, 4-toed, but the toes were wrong. Too long, ending in what looked like claws the size of my fingers. The spacing of the tracks suggested a creature that weighed at least 400 pounds. But the most disturbing thing was the pattern. The tracks showed evidence of intelligence. The creature had been stalking something, had been hunting methodically, had been making decisions about where to go and what to pursue. I followed the tracks to a clearing. There I found more evidence of the kill. This time it was larger. The remains of what looked like a young black bear had been scattered across the clearing. But the concerning part was the damage. The bear had been torn apart with shocking violence. With methodical precision, the internal organs had been carefully, deliberately removed. This wasn't random predation. This was something else, something intelligent, something that was hunting, something that was feeding. I radioed for help. I had a satellite communicator, a piece of equipment I always carried for emergencies. I sent a distress signal. I reported the contamination. I reported the presence of something large and dangerous in the valley. And then I waited. Help didn't come. The satellite communicator worked fine. The message went through, but no rescue team arrived. Instead, I received a message from the Environmental Protection Agency. The message was terse. It said that the valley was under federal quarantine, that I needed to evacuate immediately, that I was in a restricted area, not an abandoned chemical plant, a restricted area, which meant someone knew about this. Someone knew about the contamination. Someone knew about what had happened here, and they deliberately kept it secret. I started to hike out of the valley. I was done documenting. I was done investigating. I was just going to leave and report what I found to the media, to environmental organizations, to anyone who would listen. But something stopped me. It was moving through the trees about 200 yards away. I could see the shape of it, silhouetted against the forest. And it was enormous, much larger than I expected from the tracks. The creature moved on 4 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The back legs were longer than the front legs, creating a hunched posture that suggested the creature was evolved for a different kind of locomotion than normal quadrupeds used. And then the creature turned its head toward me, and I saw the face. It had too many eyes, 5, maybe 6, arranged in a pattern across what might have been a face. The eyes were luminous, actually glowing with a faint greenish light. The mouth was too large. The jaw was distended. The teeth were visible even with the mouth closed, extending beyond what should have been the limits of the skull. I understood in that moment that this thing was a mutated version of something that had existed before. This was something new, something that the chemical contamination had created from the genetic damage of multiple animals. Something that had somehow synthesized the traits of different species into a single horrifying organism. I ran. I abandoned my camp. I abandoned my equipment. I just ran, crashing through the forest, branches tearing at my face, rocks threatening to trip me, but I kept moving. I could hear the creature behind me. I could hear the heavy footfalls. I could hear the horrible, wrong sounds that it made. That discordant howling. That wet, labored breathing. I burst out of the forest onto the old logging road that connected to the highway. My car was parked about a quarter mile away. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with exhaustion. I could hear the creature emerging from the forest behind me. I could hear it moving faster, covering ground with an efficiency that suggested it had been built for pursuit. I made it to my car. I threw myself inside and slammed the door. I started the engine just as the creature reached the road. I saw it clearly for the first time. Saw the full horror of it. Saw what the chemicals had created. It was roughly the size of a large bear, but twisted. Multiple limbs sprouted from odd locations on its body. Its skin was mottled with patches of different colors and textures. Some areas looked almost reptilian. Other areas appeared to be exposed muscle. It had a tail that didn't match the rest of its body, suggesting it had incorporated genetic material from at least 4 or 5 different species. And it moved. It moved with an intelligence that transcended animal instinct. It analyzed my car. It understood what a car was. It understood that I was inside it. The creature, its luminous eyes tracked my movement inside the vehicle. And it made a sound like speech, almost like something trying to form words through a throat that had never been designed for human language. I put the car in gear and drove. I didn't look back. I drove down the logging road at speeds that were dangerous on the uneven terrain. I drove until I hit the paved road. I drove for 2 hours until I reached the nearest town with police. And I reported everything. The police didn't believe me. Or rather, they believed me but didn't want to believe me. They took my statement. They filed a report. They asked if I'd been drinking. They asked if I'd been alone for too long. They suggested that stress and isolation had caused me to see things that weren't there. But then they made some phone calls, and suddenly their attitude changed. Suddenly they weren't questioning my story. Suddenly they were asking me very specific questions about what I'd seen. How many legs? What color eyes? How large? What sounds it made? A woman from the Environmental Protection Agency arrived within hours. She was polite but firm. She told me that the valley was known to be contaminated, that the chemicals had indeed caused mutations in the local wildlife, that there was a predator in the valley that had evolved beyond normal animal behavior, and that the EPA was taking steps to contain the problem. Contain? I asked. You mean the thing is still out there? You mean you already knew about it? We suspected, the woman said carefully. There have been incidents. Hikers gone missing. Hunters who went into the valley and didn't come back. They've been studying the phenomenon, trying to understand the scope of the problem. Your observations are helpful. They confirm that the creature is growing larger, growing more intelligent. Growing? I asked. It's still evolving? The chemicals are still mutating it? The contamination is ongoing, the woman said. The tanks continue to leak. The groundwater continues to spread the chemicals. The wildlife continues to be exposed. And the predator at the top of the food chain continues to absorb genetic material from its prey. Each time it feeds, it incorporates new traits, new abilities, new intelligence. I felt my blood run cold. What do you plan to do? For now, the woman said, we're going to expand the quarantine zone. We're going to increase monitoring. And we're going to try to determine if the creature poses a danger beyond the valley. Beyond the valley. Those words haunted me. It's been 3 weeks since I escaped from Blackwell Valley. 3 weeks since I encountered the abomination. 3 weeks since I understood that nature itself can become corrupted, can become twisted into something horrifying, can evolve in directions that should never be possible. I've been having nightmares. I keep seeing those luminous eyes. Keep hearing that discordant howling. Keep remembering the sound of the creature trying to speak, trying to communicate something through a throat that had never been designed for human language. And I've been reading news reports, trying to find any information about the valley, trying to understand if anyone else knows what is happening there. But there is nothing. No news coverage, no reports of the contamination, no warnings issued to the public. Just silence, just the official quarantine that keeps everyone away. But I keep wondering. The creature was intelligent. It was evolving. It was getting larger and more capable. And it was stuck in a valley that was itself contaminated, filled with genetic material from dozens of species. What if it figures out how to escape? What if it discovers how to move beyond the valley? What if it reaches a place where it can feed on larger prey? On livestock? On humans? The scary thing, ISN, the abomination itself. The scary thing is knowing that it exists. The scary thing is understanding that the contamination is still ongoing. The scary thing is realizing that we have created the conditions for something new to evolve. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that exists anyway. Something that is getting smarter and larger and more dangerous with each passing day. I reported everything to environmental organizations. I sent my photographs to journalists. I tried to expose what was happening in Blackwell Valley. But nothing came of it. No articles, no investigations, no public outcry. The EPA contained the information. The government kept it sealed. And nothing changed, except the nightmares kept coming. Except I started hearing the howling in my dreams. Except I kept seeing those luminous eyes staring at me from the darkness. And except I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow the abomination knew I had escaped. That somehow, across the distance, through whatever connection we made when I looked into its alien eyes, it was aware of me. It was hunting me through my nightmares, waiting for an opportunity. The scariest part is that I'm not even sure the creature is still in the valley. The EPA woman mentioned expansion of the quarantine zone. What if that means the creature has already escaped? What if it is already out there, in the wider world, moving toward populated areas? What if it is adapting to different environments? What if the next person who encounters it won to get away? I am writing this account while I can still articulate what happened, because something is calling to me, something from the valley, something with luminous eyes and a voice that was never meant to exist in human ears. And I don't think I'm going to be able to stay away much longer. The nightmare is evolving, the horror is becoming real, and the abomination is still out there. Still hunting, still learning, still growing, still waiting for the moment when the quarantine fails, when the valley can no longer contain it, when the thing they accidentally created finally claims the world beyond the poisoned ground. If you discovered a hidden ecosystem that had been poisoned by human negligence, an ecosystem where nature itself had been corrupted and twisted into something dangerous and new, would you expose it to the world at any cost, or would you keep it secret to protect people from the knowledge of what exists? Write your answer in the comments.